Hello everyone, Omar Ramos here. Thank you so much for participating in Latinos Progresando's Mex Talks series. We'll get you to our scheduled program, but I want to take this opportunity to talk about the organization that's bringing you this unique event that celebrates the history, contributions, and rich diversity of the Mexican culture in the United States. Latinos Progresando is a critical organization right here in Chicago, and so much of the work is ensuring Chicago families have the access to the resources and opportunities they need to thrive. From supporting parent leadership and small business development, hosting community events that promote mental and physical wellness, and opening the doors for community members to have access to transportation and green space, LP is rooted in building on the community strengths. LP's reach extends beyond Chicago's southwest side as they provide immigration legal services to thousands of families every year from 22 states in the USA and more than 40 countries around the world. While a lot of LP's programming is built on a visionary framework to open up new opportunities for the community, the organization also takes the lead to meet immediate needs in times of crisis. This has never been more true than during COVID-19. As just a few examples, LP has mobilized to provide close to 30,000 units of PPE and 100,000 in financial assistance to families and small businesses, answer urgent immigration questions via a hotline, and serve more than 3,000 families in a weekly pop-up food pantry. Going above and beyond is in Latinos Progresando's DNA, and it all started with just one guy trying to help people. It is my pleasure to introduce to you LP's founder and CEO, Luis Gutierrez.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. When Latinos Progresando created Mex Talks, we set out to create a platform that would celebrate Mexican culture, highlight everything that Mexicans bring to this country, and use Mexican voices to tell Mexican stories. This is our 8th year hosting Mex Talks, but our first time going virtual. Our community has faced a lot this year, and it's taking a lot of hands and hearts to respond. While times like this remind us of our vulnerability, they also remind us how selfless and resilient our community is. That's why, for this year's Mex Talks, we wanted to talk about our own power to heal. Before I introduce today's lineup, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Constellation Brands, and all of the Mex Talks 2020 sponsors. Our panelists today will share their vision for a Chicago that serves our next generation. I'm proud to introduce our moderator, Maria Inés Zamudio, award-winning investigative reporter for WBEZ. Enjoy.
Hi.
Hi, Maria.
Welcome. Hi. Bienvenidos, paisanos. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Maria Inés Zamudio. I'm a reporter with WBEZ, that's the Chicago NPR station. I'm really excited to be here. I hope that you can join the conversation on Twitter. You can use the hashtag Mex Talks, MEX Talks. I'm so grateful that we're able to have this conversation. I'm grateful that we're having this space to talk about who we are, our identity, and also build a future for ourselves, a future in a city that we call home, right? Chicago. Before we get started, I really wanted to sort of dive in and understand what Mexicanos bring to this community. There are 1.3 million of us living in Chicago. That includes Mexican immigrants like myself and the children of Mexican immigrants. By the year 2030, our population is expected to double. That's according to a report by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. That means that we are crucial in this city. And that's why we're here today. I did want to take a few minutes to acknowledge that COVID-19 has ravaged the Little Village community with the highest rates of infection and deaths. COVID-19 has taken the lives of thousands of Chicagoans, and it has also stolen our ability to grieve together, something that we hold very dear to our community. I wanted to just take a few minutes to acknowledge them and their families. Let me introduce you to our panelists. Jose Muñoz is the Executive Director of La Casa Norte. Carmen Vergara is the Chief Operations Officer at Esperanza Health Centers. Berto Aguayo is the Executive Director of Increase the Peace. Thank you so much for doing this conversation. It's so needed, especially during this time of crisis. I want to jump right in. The pandemic has really highlighted the inequalities that Black and Latino Chicagoans face because of how segregated our city is. What can we do, or how do we build a more equitable Chicago? How can we as Mexicanos do this? Let's start with Carmen.
Hi, good afternoon, Maria. It's a pleasure to be here and joining the Mex Talks family, and a pleasure to also join our two panelists, Jose and Berto. Thank you both also for being here. It's a very complex question, and of course we could talk about it for days. But the one thing that I do want to highlight is that inequities lead directly to poverty. And poverty, we know that if we close that gender pay gap, that we would reduce poverty by up to 40%. And so I think that in this society, we pay for what we perceive as value in front of us. And right now we're paying Mexicanas, Latina women 56 cents on the dollar. And that's problematic. And what this tells me is that we're really not valuing Latina women as we should. And I think that what we need is a cultural shift in the way that we think about Latinas and how we perceive them, and really expand that view beyond to the traditional Latina role, and really think about Latinas as investors, as philosophers, as environmentalists, as artists, so many other avenues, because that's really who we are. And until we really start to see ourselves as that and be treated that way, I think it's gonna be difficult to close that gap. But what we do need is a cultural shift in how we envision Latina women.
If I could just add, I think first of all, I want to say hi to everyone. Thank you for hosting this and being moderating this conversation, Maria, and Berto and Carmen. It's great to see you both. I agree with Carmen. I think it's gonna, there's just a lot of intentional investment that needs to be made in our city. And I think when you think about inequities that exist in our city, in particular in Chicago, they're all driven by poverty. And we've faced decades upon decades of disinvestment in our city, particularly in communities of color. The Latinos, we know that in order to be able to change that, it's going to take some intentional investment. And, people always ask, well, what does that mean? What do you invest in? Well, you're not investing in housing. We have to make sure that we have affordable housing available in our communities. But we also need to invest in things like access to education. It's not enough. Our Latino dropout rates are dropping, and college enrollment is on the rise. It's still difficult for many to get through college and graduate. Our graduation rates are still among some of the lowest when it comes to out of a four-year university. And there's ways to be able to help to do that, to make course correct that. And one way is to make free college is free. I mean, you could do that. Some cities are making it city colleges completely free. We could do that. The other thing is, one of the things we're facing right now because of COVID is access to information, because many homes still are without Wi-Fi. And to embark on an effort to digitally connect all our youth and make Wi-Fi available universally across our city it would make it much easier for young people to engage and be able to get online and find information that they need. And so that's an information gap that we can shrink by just doing two simple things. We also got to think about when we think about investment, when we're building infrastructure. When you look at some of the best high schools in our city, they're not located in communities of color. And so as we start, looking at building new and developing new opportunities for education, or investing in the development of parks or any other infrastructure investment, they have to be made in communities of color. And when you start thinking about Latinos in general, we Mexicanos and Latinos in general tend to have some of the highest home ownership rates. The wealth gap is still something that we need to fix. We're not as wealthy as other populations, but we are buying homes, and about 46% of all Latinos are homeowners. And so, we're investing in our communities. We need our city to invest back in our communities and invest in our families.
Berto, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, no, I think Carmen and Jose are right on about tackling the systemic and structural causes that afflict a lot of our communities, whether that's, education outcomes or health outcomes. And I think in addition to those policy goals, I think in order to build a more equitable Chicago for Mexicanos, I think we need to look to our ancestors, specifically our Mayan ancestors, and that old Mayan poem that says in Lakesh, right? That you are my other me. And that if I commit harm to you, then I commit harm to myself. But if I love you, then I love myself. And in order to build a more equitable Chicago, we need to follow that and build Black and Brown unity. We need to ensure that we're building relationships with our Black brothers and sisters, because a lot of the issues that we face, from economic to education, from health, we are affected by the very same issues. And in a city like Chicago, where 2/3 of the city are Black and Brown folks, and primarily Mexicanos, we need to be able to build these relationships with the Black community, to build Black and Brown coalitions that can lead to some of these policy outcomes, that can lead to us tackling some of the systemic racism, the structural violence that we see in our community in the form of bad schools, in the form of disinvestment, in the form of the violence that we see in our communities. And secondly, in order to do that, I think as Mexicanos, we need to really think about and hold our community accountable and help our people and our communities check that anti-Blackness that exists in the Latino community. Be able to unlearn the behaviors that have contributed to some of the issues that we face now, whether that's machismo, whether that's anti-Blackness. We need to unlearn those and unpack those in order for us to be able to move towards a more equitable future. And then lastly, I think we also need to do a paradigm shift in how we view power as Mexicanos. No longer viewing power as zero sum, where, if a community gets more, then I get less, or if someone else has more funding, then I get less funding, because that leads to things like nonprofit gangbanging, to people being in positions of power for way too long. And I think we need to look at power as being, as Eric Liu states, being infinite, right? Being able to generate more power, the more leaders that we build in our own community, and being able to expand the table for other people to not only join in, or to create other tables when they don't serve us in our communities. So I think those are the three things that we would need in order to get to these policy-oriented goals that Jose and Carmen mentioned from an organizing perspective.
One of the things that I really enjoy is talking with young people, because they just bring up so much new ideas and energy. On Saturday, I spoke with a group of college students at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and they had really good questions. They wanted some advice. They wanted to know how we navigate white institutions as Latinos, as Mexicanos. And I've been thinking a lot about them. I ended up revisiting the work of Chicana feminist Gloria Ansaldúa, because she really explores themes of identity and space. And I think this passage, I love it so much because it shifts the perspective. And I want to read that to you all. Writing produces anxiety. Looking inside myself, my experience, looking at my conflicts engenders anxiety in me. Being a writer feels very much like being a Chicana or being queer, a lot of squirming, coming up against all sorts of walls. Or it's the opposite. Nothing defined, nothing definite, boundless, a floating state of limbo where I can kick my heels, brood, percolate, hibernate, and wait for something to happen. My question to you is, how do we make it happen? How do we teach our young people how to navigate these spaces that were not meant for us to advocate for real change? Let's start with Jose.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is we need to make that shift to believe, where we need to stop thinking as institutions that weren't meant for us, because I would challenge the fact that, the world is open, and, you can't say that, just because, we have institutions where are traditionally led by white individuals. I mean, you take any institution, let's say, for example, the financial industry and the insurance industry, predominantly dominated by white males. That doesn't mean that there's not room for a Latino or a Latina to be in that space and to thrive. And so I know at one point, just thinking back to my corporate days, and feeling like I was one of the only Latinos in that space, or being at a table where I'm the only Latino, it's a very uncomfortable position to be in. But it also provided an opportunity to be able to create space and open up that space to allow other folks to be able to come in through the same and occupy those same tables. And then just long term, I think part of it is also having conversations with youth and supporting them along the way, and more importantly, creating space for them to be able to lead. And that looks different in every different sector. When I think about the civic engagement, for example, part of helping youth become civically engaged is being able to having them understand the issues, agitating them into action. But then when they make a decision that they want to lead, is creating that space and moving back and stepping aside and letting them lead. And sometimes that can be a little bit uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to basically give up your seat or give up, because it's really what you're doing is you're passing on power and you're giving it up, and you're saying, yes, you take that on. And if more of us did that, we could see many young leaders thriving, and that's a very difficult thing to do. But I'm a firm believer that real leaders help create other leaders and help support other leaders. I met Berto a few years back, and it's one of the reasons that Berto and I have gotten along so well over the years is because we both fundamentally believe that you have to be able to create space for other folks to lead, even when it makes you uncomfortable, even when you disagree, even if you don't always support all their ideals, and what their outcome and the outcomes that they want may look very different than the outcomes you wanted. But you have to be able to accept that, and also create space to make mistakes, because sometimes people do make mistakes, and you can't chastise people. Just there's always a place to come back from that.
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out for me is that 2/3 of the city is Black and brown, but 2/3 of those tables and those boardrooms are not. And I think that we have to know that we belong in those spaces, and we have PhD in being Mexicanos and Latinos. No one knows that information like we do. And I think that that's not something that you learn in a classroom. That's not anything that that you pay for. You bring that knowledge and expertise and that skill to the table, and you have to really value that. And I think it's really important to know that we have to be part of boards where we're not represented, because in order to make the policy changes that Berto was referencing, those systemic policy changes, we need to be at those tables. And if that doesn't change, we're going to continue to perpetuate the same cycles over and over. And I would say that mentorship is really the key to the next generation. Like Jose just highlighted, I had 4 very influential mentors throughout my career. People that I am indebted to, so grateful for. Not one of them, unfortunately, is a Latina, and that's not through not looking for one. It's just that they're so few and far in between. And that's something that I've noticed, that I feel like I have to work towards breaking that cycle, and start to do my own mentoring and coaching to the next generation, because they will pay it back. And so I think that we really need to figure out where do we stop cycles to build new ones.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that I'm thinking about as I hear Carmen and Jose speak, and I think about those students, Maria, that asked you, how do you navigate these spaces? And I think about, scholars who have documented this kind of experience, whether it was Richard Delgado or W.E.B. Du Bois talking about the double consciousness. And one of the things that I would say to those young people is that we've been doing it, right? No somos ni de aquí ni de allá. And we've been navigating spaces that, whether it was school, I didn't learn English till the 5th grade, right? And we've been navigating these spaces all along. And I think it is a skill to be able to talk all these different languages, but in order for us to be able to authentically navigate some of these spaces, that's the first precondition, being able to be your authentic self, right? Being able to know who you are, to know where you're going, to know what your goals are, not only for yourself, but also for the community that raised you. So I think that's one. And I think secondly, that also requires for us to know our history. And I would say there's a responsibility in the elder Chicanos from Chicago leaders of passing down the history of people like Rudy Lozano, passing down the history of people like Ray Castro, right? Histories of people that have been here in Chicago and have, contributed to what the city is now. And I think, thirdly, one of the things that we need as young people and as people navigating these spaces is knowing who you are, knowing the history, and also when it's your turn to pass it forward. I've been, lucky enough to be mentored by people like Jose, who have been willing to give up space, who have been willing to take a 10 p.m. phone call. And I think what we need to do then is, once we get to that space, is being able to be that person that we needed when we were younger, to be able to pass down that history, pass down that guidance, and help other young people be their authentic self so they don't get lost in a place that, as you said, wasn't designed for us, but we are now infiltrating and being a part of and making it our own.
I love that. Really flipping the narrative and thinking about the duality that you hold within yourself. I really want to also dedicate some time and space for conflicts that we have within our own communities. So I love my culture. I was born and raised in Mexico. There's so much beauty in Mexicanidad, but I think that many of us don't necessarily address some of the negative parts of it, right? There is a lot of machismo in our homes. There is gender-based violence that cripples our community. So how do we think, or what are the ways in which we can address the machismo within our own communities? Berto, we'll start with you this time.
Yes, I think one of the things that I think has really helped me navigate some of the spaces that I navigate now is the fact that I was raised by all women. It was my single mother, single grandma, single aunt, 3 younger sisters, all living in the same apartment. And they were feministas before they even knew what the term meant or was, right? Doing it on their own, challenging some of these patriarchal systems that we have accustomed to. And I think one of the things that we need to do as leaders, and maybe as older leaders, is that willingness to unlearn, right? That willingness to see that the way that we've been doing things may not be right. And that willingness to unlearn also comes with the willingness to be held accountable, right? The willingness to be able to listen and say, "Oh, you know what? I took up way more space than I should have at that meeting. I didn't let someone else speak, and I was monopolizing the conversation." Or, even now, as I think about Increase the Peace, knowing that, hey, now Increase the Peace is all woman ran right now. And that means I need to take myself out of the equation and help uplift the women that are leading some of this work. And that requires a lot of, willingness to, on all fronts, to be held accountable, to unlearn, but also the responsibility to uplift the women in our communities and the work that they do.
If I can add something to that, just thinking about something Berto said, I think about that as a young man, when I think about, I have a mom and sisters who are also very independent and, in a lot of ways, definitely my mom and my older sisters who helped raise me. I also have daughters and, thinking myself as a young dad. And for a long time as a young man, I never considered myself as a machista. I was like, I got to pass because, I was raised by women. They led me, they told me what to do, and they did teach me a lot. But it wasn't until I started getting a little older that I started realizing that there's a lot of things that are just ingrained in our culture that we have to acknowledge and we have to believe, to point out and, acknowledge the fact that that those things exist. And because that's the first step in trying to make that change, and some things are very deep-seated in our culture. And what really got me thinking is I started seeing my daughters get a little older and started realizing that, especially when I think of my 16-year-old who's very vocal and reminds me all the time about the things that I do different with her that I didn't do with her older brother. and she calls me on it and reminds me, and I have to stop and think back. I was like, you're right. I'm as much as liberal as I think I am, as as much as I try to raise her to be independent, to do the things, there are things that are a part of me that where I just just stop her from doing things. And so I think that I actually recently had this conversation with Carmen. I'm just like, it's like just really thinking through the fact that I have to acknowledge that those things are there before I can make that change. And once we acknowledge that they exist, then we can start moving forward and start making changes in those things, because it is definitely a part of our culture that has to change.
And yeah, absolutely. I agree with Jose and what Berto said. I was born and raised in Middle Village, and I would say that the first time that I was harassed in public in the community, I was about 10 years old. And that's wrong. It's completely wrong. And machismo is toxic to our culture, and it's likely the most self-destructive characteristic of our culture. And the thing about machismo is that it's more than just a belief. It's an actual action. And a lot of times these actions are rooted in aggressive behavior. And it's aggressive behavior not towards somebody of your own size. It's aggressive behavior towards people who identify as women, and aggressive behavior towards children. And when this happens to children, it's learned behavior, and you begin to perpetuate these cycles again. And so I think that and kudos to the men who are working so hard to break those cycles, because they're recognizing how destructive they can be. And I think that what we need to do is, as we're asking white people to denounce racism, I think the action is to ask men to denounce machismo. If you see it, if you hear it, say something. And it's not easy, I'm sure, but I think hearing that from your brother, from your primo, from your colleague at work can be very meaningful to really understand what machismo is and how destructive it could be for our culture.
Yeah, I think you guys bring up so many good points. It is something that you learn. It is ingrained in you, and it takes a lot of effort to rectify that pattern of thinking and behavior. And no one is immune from it, right? I think women also can uphold some of those standards and some of the criticism that also comes from other women. So I wanted to also spend some time and really think about healing. We are in a really difficult time. We are in the blink of major changes in the Supreme Court. We are living through a pandemic that it has killed more people than we can count, and also going through a racial reckoning of this country's long-rooted problems with racism. And I wonder, what are some of the things that you are doing within yourself and your families to promote healing, and then also finding some space for joy? Can you share some of that with us? Anyone can start.
I'll start off. I when I think about those, first of all, just to your first part of your question about how do we start healing, and the first step is to have a conversation. And I'm speaking specifically just when I think about my family. It's just creating space for my kids, my wife and I, to have a conversation and sit down and have these dinner conversations about what we're seeing, not just in the news, but what we're seeing in our community, and acknowledging that there are issues that need to be addressed. And then more broadly, is participating in just having this conversation. Just the fact that we're even talking about it is a first step to trying to address some of those issues that we're seeing. And then when you talked about joys, individual, look, COVID has been very difficult for a lot of us. But the one thing that it has done, has created opportunities for us to get closer. I just thinking about my family and spending time at home, and my wife and I are spending more one-on-one time now than we ever have in the past. Because we're stuck with each other. It's a good thing we get along. So, but we spend times, just sometimes it's just reconnecting, having conversations, sitting in the yard, spending time watching movies at home, having conversations about those movies, reaching out to friends and family, even if it is just through a Zoom or a phone call. But I think the people that I'm closest with, it has brought us closer together, and I think I've seen a lot of positive things come out of it, because it helps you, reminds you of what things are important, to prioritize the things that matter the most. And at the end of the day, it's not what's happening out in the world. What's most important for me is what's happening at home, and and focusing in on the people that matter the most to me.
Yeah, I would agree with Jose that whenever I get to spend some time with my family or even friends, whether it's through Zoom or FaceTime, I do feel, although not the same connection, but I do feel some just relief that, that relationship is still there, that bond is still there, that hasn't been removed. I do miss the affection. I do miss like the hugs for my little nephews because, they're, my world and they mean so much to me. So that is, of course, missed, but I am definitely looking forward to the days where we could, do that once again. And as far as, healing, healing is a very personal process. And I think it's also at everyone's own individual pace. And I think that everyone, is doing it sort of at their own different way. For myself, I need a lot of me time to really just kind of process. COVID is my all day, every day as a healthcare executive. That's, what I'm like in and out my entire day. And so I really try to step back, go for walks, and really sort of stimulate all my other senses, thinking about, I leave my phone at home so that I'm not, bothered throughout the day, but I'm out there really thinking about, what noises do I hear? What smells do I hear? What sounds? And, how does the wind feel on my face? Just to really be in that present moment that can often be very challenging to do throughout day to day. And I would say that probably my guilty pleasure has been, I've been getting myself a lot of fresh cut flowers for, my apartment, just because I feel like they're just, beautiful. They brighten up my space, and it just, gives me something to look at when I'm sort of feeling like, the day is overwhelming. So even the simple things, I think really, really help to give me joy. And I think being at home and not being able to have environmental stimulus like we typically do has really, given me a greater appreciation for what I do have at home and the natural beauty that we have around us every day.
Yeah.
I think I need to get me some flowers too. That sounds really therapeutic. Yeah, no, I think one of the things, I think a couple things that I find healing in, and that I think folks might find helpful, is number one, being able to establish healthy boundaries, right? In organizing, we teach, public versus private. And I think especially now with a lot of us working from home, with the lines between public and private life being so mixed, being able to establish those boundaries between when you don't answer the phone, when you don't look at your Twitter or email, right? And being disciplined with those boundaries, because as we all say, right, it's a marathon, not a sprint. In order to finish that marathon, we need to establish those healthy boundaries that will help allow us to succeed in the long term. Secondly, I think that we need to have fun with the work that we do. It doesn't all need to be, all these issues are so overwhelming, but we need to have fun. I think about a march that we held on 4th of July weekend to prevent violence in back of the yards. And we had a youth group who was on top of a truck, doing some live music with their guitars, singing, and people were dancing. And it was a violence prevention march to promote peace. And we were honoring our loved ones, but, we have that in our culture of those moments of our music or food, being able to have fun in the organizing work that we do. Third, I would say look for those mentors and those people that you can lean on. Because I know, and I reference Jose again, because I know that when I have tough times, he's somebody that I know I can pick up the phone, and I find healing in our conversations, even if they're about the most mundane things. They're talking about, chente, or talking about, whoever it may be or whatever it may be, finding those people that can be your village of support, that village of nurturing. Because I think I find healing through those relationships. So I would say those three things.
Yeah, just for our audience, we will have an opportunity to ask some of your questions for our panelists. So make sure that you use the hashtag Mexi Talks. I'm sorry, it's hashtag Mex Talks. And we will get those questions to me and I can ask the panelists. So as we wait for those questions, are there any Mexican writers or authors or thinkers that you are turning to in this time of reflection?
Oh, I would say I listen to Maria Hinojosa all day long on her podcast. She's incredible. And I think the stories that she is profiling, I think are just also important for everyone to hear. I do feel pretty well versed in the Mexican, community here in Chicago, but maybe not so much with what's happening in the border, what's happening in California and New York and in other places. But she, profiles some beautiful stories that I think help keep me, in tune with really what's happening across the nation with Latinos, because it's so different in different places. And so she's definitely my go-to. Also, when I want to hear something that inspiring, something to work towards. So she's definitely one of my heroes, and also a former Mex Talks member. So I'm really happy to really highlight her.
Yeah.
That's great. Carmen, I had the same thing written down, so you kind of just stole my answer there. But
should have gone first, I'll say.
Yeah, no, but that's great. No, I think a lot of us are tuning into it more and more, and I agree with for me, I want to hear more stories. I actually just ordered a book called Guardians by Ana Castillo, which talks about it's just a story of an immigrant story of something happening in the border. And I think one of the things that, and we haven't talked about this here, and it's completely unrelated, but we haven't talked enough about what is happening at our nation's border and the separation of families and youth that are right now incarcerated, and in some cases in many cases are being abused, even just by sheer nature of being held there. There was a lot of attention early on to children that were, in the separation with their families, and we would still hear about it. But it's like with everything else, we got to be very intentional about keep talking about that, and to have conversations about that, because it is a very real thing that's happening in our border, and things need to change. Our community is being targeted. Whether we want to admit to it or not, it is happening. Mexicanos are being targeted from every space, but particularly politically. And so if I could put a plug out there, it's just a reminder for everyone to make sure you're registered to vote, that you're filling out your census forms as well, but that you're out there and that you do vote in this next election, and that you vote with your conscience, without putting a plug for anyone, but just going out there, making sure that you're thinking about these families, you're thinking about our families, our immigrant journey. When I think about my family and all the things that they did in order to be able to get to this country to do so that I can do the things that I can do today, it started with them making that journey. And many of us in our family went through that same thing. So, so just the thought there I wanted to bring up.
Since you brought that up, Jose, I think about what's happening at the border and thinking about the women who are having procedures done who don't know what they are consenting to, if at all. I think that's something that needs to be investigated, because it's happened before in this country, and to be happening in 2020 is egregious. And I think that we really need to call to have that investigated, like, immediately.
Yeah, for those of you that don't know what's going on right now, it's just that there's some was it Georgia, where there was some women that are have been talking about some of the procedures that have happened, and there was I believe a report that came out detailing some of the what they believe may even be hysterectomies that were to prevent them from having more children. Which, to me, again, it's another clear example that our community is being targeted with the intent of extinguishing us. And make no mistake, though, that part of that reason is the fact that we are growing in terms of numbers, and we are predicted to be a major majority in this country. And I think for some folks, it just may scare them. And so we got to keep an eye out on all those things that are happening. And yes, I agree with you. We need to start there has to be a very thorough investigation what's going on there.
Yeah, Berto, if I don't know if you want to answer that question, but we actually got another question from the audience that I think you may have some thoughts around. So they're asking, how do we create political power that creates the change that we need in the Mexican community?
Wow. Okay. So I'll answer the book question and then that one, because I think it's, especially as I'm thinking about all the gender-based violence that we're talking about, all the machismo, I'm thinking about Paquita la del Barrio and how advanced, ahead of her time she was. Right. But I also want to do a couple plugs for a book, The Latino Condition by Richard Rodriguez. It's a great book, second edition. talks about all these stories of Mexican artists like Martin Ramirez, who became a great artist and was mistakenly put in a psych ward. And later on, it was discovered that he was this great artist and painter. And thinking about all the mental health issues that we face in our community and how a lot of the issues that we face in the Latino community, we don't talk enough about mental health and about overall well-being, and how we sometimes confuse and stigmatize some of these mental health issues. And on the question of political power, especially if you look at Mexicanos and being 2/3 of Latinos in the US, and the thought that Latinos will be the majority in 2050, that means a big majority of that will be Mexicanos, most of which, 50% of which are under the age of 27. So I think in order to build political power, we need to start with our young people, and we need to let our young people lead. And the reason I say that is because I think our young people know the language of other young people and how to engage them best in the civic process to make things fun, to be able to connect the very abstract, sometimes political and policy issues to their everyday life and how we live in our communities, right? Seeing how your vote is tied to the violence that we witness in our community, being able to talk to a young brother on the block and talk about how, hey, there's people who benefit out of your incarceration. There's people who make money out of your incarceration. There's people who make money out of the caskets that they sell to our communities because we fail to change our communities through our vote, and we're killing each other, right? Or we're attacking one another. So I think it's about how do we provide spaces where our young people are leading, because the next generation is the generation that will take us over the top. And I think in order to build political power, we need to start building civic habits and the civic traditions in our young people to be civically engaged long-term.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I also wonder, what does it mean for us to mentor young people and the way that we have to do it? Because one of the things that I encounter a lot in my reporting is this generational trauma that really just impacts the way that you even communicate with others, and the ways in which you are triggered and you are reacting to your trauma, not necessarily what is happening. So I often see a lot of miscommunication between mentors and the young folks, because it does require so much love and patience to be able to have that conversation. So I really appreciate this. There is another question that I want to make sure I get to. And it says, as we prepare for the next generation, what will you take with you from the past generations as tools, and what would you leave behind? For example, take me with healing and limpias, leaving anti-Blackness.
I think one thing that I would definitely take with me and would consistently express to the next generation is the Mexicano work ethic, because I think that we see that across, all of our family members and what that really represents. And so that's something that's very important to me. And I think that it's something that I would want to continue to carry on. I think that what I would definitely leave behind is, our, outdated view of the Latina woman and who she is, and, what limitations, they, have been pressed upon the Latina woman. And so that's something that I think needs to evolve within the Mexican culture.
I would echo Carmen's sentiment about what we should leave behind. I agree with that 100%. But in terms of what we would take with us in the future, I think is courage. When I think about being Mexicano and I think about my family and I mentioned them coming to this country, it takes a lot of courage to leave everything behind, your language, your culture, and to come into a strange land and be a part of a country that in very ways is very unwelcoming, and still do it for the sake of, like, when I think of my family, they thought about the future that they wanted to create for their kids, and so if we're going to take something with us, take that with us. It takes a lot of courage to be able to do a trip like that and to do the things that we are doing in this country.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would take with me from the past is a couple things. Like Carmen mentioned, definitely our work ethic. I think about, our paleteros, teloteros. I think about, my mom, who was a tamalera, when she came to this country, and definitely that work ethic and that humility that comes with it. Secondly, I would probably say, like, our big focus on family being able to, go to La Carne Asada and all your tios and tias are there. I think about that in those moments that nourish somebody. And then lastly, I would say language. I think being able to now teaching my little sister how to speak Spanish, right? And I think about just a quick story. I remember being in second grade in elementary school in back of the yards, and there was a Polish teacher who I didn't know the language and I didn't know English. So she would ridicule me and make me sit on the floor, take away my desk, take away my chair, make me study on the floor. And I think about the way in which a dominant culture like the Anglo-Saxon culture will try to mute our culture by taking away our voice and our language, right? So I think it's important to be able to pass on the language of Spanish, to be able to not only communicate with our elders, but also to read our stories, to read our history, and to think about where we've been. The things that I would definitely leave behind, definitely challenging our community to eradicate that anti-Blackness that exists in our community, eradicate the machismo, so we don't perpetuate it for generations to come in the future, and uplifting women, ensuring that we uplift the work that they do, we uplift their voices, and that also means, not taking space that they might justly deserve.
Yeah. Not sure if you stop talking, sorry. Just want to make sure I am keeping tabs on everything. So one of the other questions that I think, first of all, I'm so sorry that happened to you, Berto. It's, I've heard many stories about teachers who target Latino students. But I want to get back to one of the questions that came in through the chat, and that is that people want to know what are some of the steps that we can take to work with other communities of color.
I guess I'll go first to break the awkward silence. So one of the things that I think we need to do is I really follow the TRHT model, the truth, racial healing, and transformation piece, because I think first we need to have those true, honest dialogues, right, between communities, and even within our communities, right, and that requires those truthful, honest conversations. Require checking your tío who says something that he shouldn't say because he just doesn't know, and educating him on why that's considered racist and that he shouldn't say something like that, right? Those are honest conversations, but also having conversations between African American, Black folks, Mexican folks, and being able to have honest conversations about what are the myths that we've learned about each other, what are the misunderstandings that we've had about each other, and what are some of the similarities that bridge us closer together. And then that's when I think some of that racial healing can happen. First, we have those honest conversations. We have that honest dialogue, rooted in truth and rooted in a belief that we got to eradicate the racial hierarchy system that's been placed on us for way too long. And then moving to a racial healing piece where after we have those honest conversations, we move into action. We move into how do we best support, whether it's on the streets or in the boardroom, our Black brothers and sisters, and vice versa, right? And then I think that's when the transformation can begin to happen through those honest conversations that hopefully lead to action that then will help transform our communities, because our liberation is intertwined, and the success of one community means the success of another, especially when we're 2/3 of the city. If we got together and fought against all the systemic issues that afflict both communities, it's over with.
Yeah.
So we have 5 minutes left. Please.
Yeah, just something very quick to add on something that Berto said earlier on. It's also important to remember that it's a reminder, and this goes across all communities, that one group being in power does not mean take away power from someone else. And that's something we got to constantly keep reminding each other of, that just because one person or one particular group is moving forward, that we should continue to support them. That doesn't mean it's gonna stop your group from moving forward, or Latinos from moving forward. And then the other thing I want to add is just something related to this question about how do we build political power. I think one important thing that we haven't talked enough about, that it needs to be something that we constantly be thinking about, is the concept of building generational wealth. yes, we want communities to come out of poverty. We want families to get ahead, but we really got to start thinking about, when we're thinking about wealth, about 2 or 3 generations from now. And that we need to be able to use that wealth to be able to move and direct policy change, because that's ultimately, that's another piece of how things happen. So when you think about political campaigns and the work that they're doing, part of it is, what's directing that agenda is also the folks that are funding those campaigns and providing money to those campaigns. And there are many campaigns that have, even at the grassroots level, that have not picked up the momentum they needed, because there was just, they ran out of money, and did not have the, people weren't investing in it. So it's so super important that if you're out there and you're thinking about, you want to get politically engaged, yes, you got to vote, you got to get others to vote, you got to talk about the issues. You also have to invest with your dollars into those campaigns and those ideas.
I think I wanted to highlight the places in the city where there's still significant amount of segregation. So really thinking about our schools. Growing up in Little Village, I went to a predominantly Latino grade school. And for high school, I went to a school that was mixed. It was half Latino and half Black. And it was really my first introduction to Black culture. And I think that it was way too late in terms of I should have been introduced to this much earlier. To really get to understand another culture. And I think that, we still see this happening, 20 years later, but even beyond our education spaces, but even our workspaces as well. And this expands beyond just the racial divide, but also the exposure to folks of other communities, like the LGBTQ community as well. Our culture has, the Mexican culture has, still some significant, challenges and views about the LGBT community. And I think it's something to also continue to highlight that, exposure early on, to families and to young children leads to better outcomes and acceptance of communities different from our own. So I think it's something to really think about.
Yeah, those are great points to bring across. And, to the point about us not really being able to engage with other cultures, that is 100% one of the issues that comes with segregation. So that is the struggle, that is our struggle collectively as a community of a city that has been shaped so much by those policies. So I don't have any more questions. We wanted to make sure that we are holding space for these kinds of conversations because we have time, and this is the time for us to really think about what is working, what can we do to shape our future in this city. And I wonder if you have one last piece of advice that you could give to our youth that are witnessing all of these really difficult things in 2020. What kind of advice would you give them?
I would say, one form of advice would be just don't lose hope. There's a lot of change that still needs to happen. And I know sometimes you may feel like you're alone in the world, or, they were isolated, or they were being, disenfranchised. That doesn't mean that things can't change, because they can. There's a lot of leaders out there who already paved the way for you. When I think about just even my own growth, it's really been because of folks who have, gave me their hand, give me a hand up and created space for me to be able to do the things that I'm doing today. And so just don't lose hope. There's still a lot of change that needs to be made, and you're positioned to be able to make that change happen.
Yeah, I would say that think about life kind of as lifelong. Think about your life outside of the community that you grew up in, and what that might look like. I started my healthcare career as an 18-year-old when I was a medical assistant at a small private clinic on 26th Street. And now to be able to be a healthcare executive, running clinics on the southwest side of the city of Chicago was something that I didn't think about on day one of my first job as an MA. And so really to envision what your life could possibly look like. I mean, if I could go back to myself and say, this is what you could become, I think I would have had so much more hope and inspiration and belief in myself, and probably would have not gone through, some insecurities that I did go through, as, first generation college graduate. And I think it's something that I want to share with our viewers, that there is a path forward. There is a path beyond what, you have been growing up in, and a lot of us are here rooting for you and supporting you. And if we know about you, we would definitely be lifting you up to that next step.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Do you want to share anything else, or?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I would tell young people would be that you're more powerful than you think, right? And on organizing, we teach that power is simply defined as the ability to act, and we all have that ability to act and change our communities. And I think sometimes people in positions of power want to make us feel powerless. And I think about my own upbringing in back of the yard, single mother, dealing with some of the systemic issues that we spoke about, going into gang life, and then being able to come out of it because of the village that raised me. I always felt powerless. And then someone along the way sparked that power in me and helped show me that power is just that, simply the ability to act. And I think being able to have that understanding that you can really change your community through your actions, and that you can be the change that you want to see in your community.
Yeah, I have been thinking a lot about change, and I think that what I find hope in is that we can take this time to evaluate what we're doing in order to prepare for the change. How do we, because we can't stop change from happening. So how do we harness that energy? How do we prepare ourselves for whatever may come? Because that's really what our ancestors did, right? They adapted. And it was during that that ability to adapt that we were able to be here, that we're here, that we are thriving, that we are doing the things that we need to do to make sure that there is that there is a future, a better future for the next generation to come. So I want to thank you all for doing this very important conversation. I think is very timely. This is the time for us to really rethink through our strategies and thinking about what we need and what we deserve. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to the panelists. And thank you so much, Latinos Progresando, for inviting me to guide you in this conversation. And I really hope that we can keep having these conversations offline. I have a bunch of books that I love from Mexican writers. So you can follow me on Twitter, Zamudio, and I can share some of those names with you. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And please, let's keep having these conversations.
That concludes our program. Thank you so much to all of our sponsors and to you at home for being here. To learn more about other events in the Mex Talks series, go to www.latinospro.org/MexTalks. You can also watch past Mex Talks videos on Latinos Progresando's YouTube channel. To support LP and the amazing work they do for our community, you can make a donation at latinospro.org/donate. You can even sign up for a monthly pledge. Make sure you follow Latinos Progresando at Latinos Pro on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter to always have the latest. Thank you.